So, ladies and gentlemen, call me Richard. Much simpler. So I'm going to talk about changing the norm. And I'm going to talk about the business of changing armed forces. I think specifically the armed forces of the United Kingdom. Although in its bones, this is really no different to changing any other institution or organization that you may now or in the future be part of. It's a process. You have to understand the journey that you've traveled in all its richness and complexity and uncertainty. You then have to understand where you are now and accept that it's not frozen. There will be aspects of your current situation which even now are changing. And even when you've done that, then you have to stretch yourself as far into the future as you can look to make sure you are grasping the risks and opportunities of the future, or you'll be designing yourself into sustained obsolescence. And if you're capable of doing all of those things, whether you're changing armed forces or anything else, then you absolutely then have to make change happen. It won't happen without leadership and effort unless you choose simply to be a victim of an uncertain future. So let's look at the journey traveled by Western and specifically the United Kingdom armed forces, because it matters and it should provoke some interesting questions about the future. So the history is clear, and this is history. An imperial history, then the world wars of the last century, First World War, Second World War, streaming seamlessly into the frozen conflict at scale of the Cold War. And that finished in 1989. And for many armed forces, including the British armed forces, that was a shock, because that was the end of a piece of history that was familiar, where armed forces existed as large conventional forces fielded on an enduring basis. And then suddenly, the requirement for that had lapsed. And some people declared the end of history. That was a bit optimistic. So there was then a process of redefinition, as expressed through the campaigns that I and others have taken part in. The Balkans, so Bosnia, Kosovo, and then Iraq and Afghanistan, and then Libya, and now Syria. And the crucial thing for you to remember there about those particular campaigns is that they were all abroad, so it was an away match. They were limited in scale and duration. At no time was your homeland at risk, or indeed your future prosperity or your prospects. And that's bred a certain sense about what the British and other European armed forces should be like in the future. But now you have to ask yourself, can you be sure that the future going forward is going to be as secure and benign as the recent past? And then we need to look at some economics. It's just very simple. If over 25 years you reduce your defense budget from roughly 4% of gross domestic product down to 2% of gross domestic product, even if you maintain the size of your defense budget in real terms, the fact is, over 25 years, if the costs of your people, your equipment, your activity, and your logistics continue to inflate above inflation year on year, and they will, and for high-end equipment, somewhere between 7 and 11%, then over time, inevitably, no matter how efficient you think you can be, you will buy less equipment, you will hire fewer people, you will do less stuff, and you will hollow out your stocks. And if you do that for 25 years, there is a risk that you will boil your frog, that you'll have something that thinks it's armed forces, that looks like armed forces, but is so small and feeble that actually it's fine as long as you don't need it. And that absolutely is a great place to be if you feel safe and you're sure the future is going to be as benign going forward as the recent past. So let's look at the world as it is already changing, your world. The first thing is, there is no shortage of conflict in our world today. Perhaps 42. Globally, we spend about $1,742 billion a year on defense and war fighting capability. There are now more than 60 million people in our world displaced by conflict alone. And there are something like 100,000 United Nations peacekeepers serving on separate operations in Africa alone. So you may think, as a resident of safe and secure Europe, that you've reached the end of history and war has left you alone. That is not the experience of billions of people in our world today. And then we need to have a conversation about the nature of war itself. It is an aspect of the human condition, if you like, part of our biological baggage, that remains unaltered over the centuries. It is unreasonable, irrational, feral, stupid, dangerous, disruptive, destructive, almost always disappointing, and almost always ends badly, and almost always starts for really bad reasons. But it is absolutely part of the human condition. So just because you've had the luxury of 25 years of a comfortable post-Cold War era does not mean that you should benchmark your armed forces against your preferred form of warfare, maybe the things you've done recently. You have to remember that for millions of people, war, the nature of war, is like this, and it never changes. And partly for those reasons, it's not helpful to talk about peace and war in the modern age. There's not a switch that you throw, except perhaps in law, where you say we were at peace and now we're at war. Any country, this happens to be the United Kingdom, any country exists with a spectrum of relationships with the people that it deals with in the world. So we will cooperate with some, we will compete with others, we will confront or be confronted by some states, and we'll be locked in a state of conflict with others, and in the particular case of our time, ISIS for sure now. And you have to manage that on a daily basis, and tune your armed forces to deal with the world as it's actually turned out, day by day, not the world that you would have it be. And you would then have to recognize that even if the nature of war doesn't change, the way it's conducted in terms of ideas and equipment and capability in the jargon changes all the time. And here's some examples. This first one here is the evolution of terrorism and extremism in our time. So traditionally, terrorism for us would be small groups of people armed with bombs and bullets who tried to kill policemen and soldiers or blow up public buildings. If you like, the traditional model of the Northern Irish terrorism that came out of the Troubles, now sadly, happily, now well contained. However, terrorism in our time is completely different. The terrorists of our time don't expect to go home, so they come with a gun and they come wearing a suicide vest and they come in numbers. And they are an existential threat. They mean to terminate your way of life, and they don't mind who they kill along the way. And they aspire to step into weapons of mass destruction, whether that's home-cooked chemical weapons or biological weapons, or to acquire other people's missiles. So this has to be dealt with, because this is a problem that has presented itself even if we didn't want it. And then, in our age, there's the issue of the significance of ballistic missiles. Now, this will not have troubled you at all, but you will have heard of nuclear missiles. But in the age we now live in, a modern, conventional, that is to say, a missile with a high explosive warhead, in the hands of countries which we may not be on best terms with, is capable of reaching your homeland. And when it comes, if it comes at Mach 6 to 7, it'll bring an 800 kilogram high explosive warhead. It'll have an accuracy of about 2 meters. It's very precise. And it will carry on board its own defensive suite, so it's really hard to shoot down. And it is, of course, as I say, traveling extremely quickly. So none of these things featured in the Balkans or Afghanistan or Iraq, but they are now a feature of the modern world. And it's not just the stuff that might come our way in the future. There's also the question of, in the jargon, A2AD, aerial denial, anti-access. A thoughtful investment by many nations around the world in advanced technology that is designed to keep other people's air forces, navies, and submarines out of their territory. So, for example, the way air forces have operated over territory like Afghanistan for a decade does not happen if you're confronted by the thing on the top right there, which is an S-400 Russian launcher. Shoots aircraft down at 400 miles. A ship won't get within 300 miles of a coast defended by modern anti-ship cruise missiles. And in the era particularly of autonomous systems, drones in the underwater space, a submarine becomes a much harder thing to sneak about the world. So you have to consider the stuff that might be fired at you, and also consider how hard it is to reach the heartland of people that you may fall out with in the future. And there are a couple of new things which may not be a surprise to you. The business of cyber. It is a normal part of the daily interaction between states and non-state actors. 2014, half of the crime in the United Kingdom, about 6 million events, were ascribed to cyber. The global annual cost of cybercrime alone is $3 trillion, which happens to be the same cost to the US of the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's just a normal part of the way people steal information, commit criminal acts, and cause harm and disruption. And in our age, perhaps as it was during the height of the Second World War, if you want to wage war, you'll not necessarily wage war by trying to destroy someone's armed forces or destroy their civil population, but you will make their daily life halt by taking down critical infrastructure. So you've never had a day in your life when you wake up and there's no power, there's no ATMs, there's no supermarket distribution systems, there's no postal system, there's no banking, there's no air traffic control, there's no traffic control in the streets, and your daily life comes to a halt. In the modern age, modern armed forces have to deal with that sort of effect created by cyber, but if necessary also by those precision ballistic missiles I referred to. And all of that is in the world we live in now and would have to be factored into how you would transform modern European armed forces. But let's look at how the world is actually going to change. And there are a number of really important things. They're going to shape all walks of life over the next generation. We live in the Asian century. Wealth and power is transitioning east. The rules-based international order which has protected us and by which we have prospered is being challenged. The institutions we have invested great confidence in are being neutered, weakened, and in some places displaced. We now live, for sure, in a generation where we, as the people of this earth, as we grow from 7 billion to 9.4 billion by about 2045, are going to outgrow the capacity of our planet to absorb all the terrible things that we do to it and to satisfy all our expectations. So inequality, migration, desertification, climate change, population growth, an aging population, all of those things are going to shape how conflict is started and where it occurs. And in particular, urbanization. Half the world's population now in cities, 2045, 2/3 of the world population in cities. Megacities of more than 20 million people. That is where war will be fought, not in the on the North German plain or some wilderness where armed forces would much prefer to operate because it's a simpler environment. And then there's this, the fourth industrial revolution. So how we all live and work and play and fight will be changed by combinations of data, processing, connectivity, autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, robotics, new materials, the use of space. It started already, and it will only accelerate over the next generation. So, of course, if you're transforming armed forces, you will look for advantage by being on the front edge of making combinations of this technology. You will not look simply to have more of the stuff that got you through the tricky years of the 1990s or the noughties. So now you have to make change actually, make change actually happen. And here we get into the human dimension. The first thing that you must have are leaders who are capable of not just running today's events, but also looking to the horizon. And I know that sounds nothing like a revelation, but it's actually very hard. So for our government today, for example, very fixated on the problem of Brexit, but it also has to think about security and the changing world that I've described. And then you need people who can think rigorously, so strong minds, and more than that, you need great reserves of moral courage, because you are going to challenge vested interest. You're going to have to overcome institutions and people who've invested their lives in a particular way of doing things, and now you're going to have to decide you're going to sweep it away in order to transform armed forces, or whatever it is that you're doing. And in doing that, you have to be so good at what you're doing that not only can you think brilliantly and bring to that thing great moral courage and conviction, but you can argue. And many great ideas fail because although they are great and brilliant, they're just never well articulated. So advocacy is as important as the idea. And you're going to have to tinker with complicated issues like this. This is the UK public sector cake, about £780 billion a year, taxpayers' money and borrowing. And if you want to transform armed forces, you're going to provoke really difficult questions like, okay, so we need to spend more money on defense. So how many fewer hospitals would you like? Or more potholes in the roads? Or lower pensions? Or less employment protection? There's no free ride here. It is an exceptionally difficult argument to mount to people who live comfortable lives and have certain expectations that for their future security or the security of their children, they may need to have less of the things that they like to spend money on stuff they don't like, which are their armed forces. And then you're going to need a team. And I hope many people watching this will aspire to be members of this sort of team. So not just military people who can think of military ideas, important though that is. You need the scientists and engineers to develop that capability. You need the civil servants who can manage the finances of it, complicated as it will be over time. You need industry and others to produce these things and to make them competitive and affordable. And you need technical skills, which I know it sounds dull, but so important. People who can write good contracts. And some people, maybe some of you in this room, will invest your lives in being good at one or more of those disciplines. Then you need time and money, because if there's one thing you need to remember in transforming armed forces, which is you may want to have all the time in the world, but you may find, and this is the New York Times from August 1914, asserting that a general European war is unthinkable, and it broke out a month later. So if you take the world I've described to you, how can you be sure that you've got all the time in the world in a leisurely way to think about transforming your armed forces for a world that may just turn out to be more threatening than the one that you have lived in your lives so far? Thank you very much.